This segment takes us to France, where the Holy See, the Vatican's legal arm, is protesting a French court ruling that held a former Vatican official responsible for wrongfully dismissing a nun from the religious order. The Lorient Tribunal criticized the Vatican's secretive process in ousting the nun after an internal investigation. Despite the Vatican claiming no notification of the verdict, it condemned the ruling as a violation of religious freedom. Cardinal Marc Ouellet, tasked by Pope Francis, led the investigation resulting in the nun's expulsion in 2020. The case reflects a trend of French courts intervening in church matters, holding high-ranking officials accountable for misconduct and cover-up. This story is from AP News by Nicole Winfield on April 13th, 2024. And I don't know that I can agree with this idea that the church is being held accountable for its misconduct and cover up. I mean, this is the Catholic Church we're talking about. In my opinion, arguably, the Catholic Church is the most corrupt criminal organization in the history of Western society, at least. And it wishes to retain its unchecked internal procedures so that it can continue to mistreat women, mistreat children, and others who oppose its abuses. And so while it has its own rules, it should not be above the law. Certainly, I think the church should allow or should be allowed to have its own procedures in place to hold its employees, if you will, accountable to. But they should by no means be able to do anything that's illegal. And we see this all across the world, decade after decade, year after year, the Catholic Church doing all kinds of things that are illegal. So I want to go over to Scott first. Can you speak to how religious organizations are prioritized by state and national governments, and whether or not it's okay for religious organizations to be held to these unique legal circumstances?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is an awesome outcome. This is a very unusual. Since the beginning of religion and the beginning of government, we've had religion trying to flex in front of the government and saying, as if they're not obligated to abide by local rules. It's not, you don't have a higher court here. And kudos to France here. France just stepped in and said, no, this is France. You will follow French laws, and we will enforce French laws. This is our country. And, the church is not going to come in and dictate what's going to happen here. The expectations remain intact. And there was a quote in the article that I think is becoming my favorite quote of any article I've ever read for the nonprofits. And here's what it says. The case is highly unusual because it represented a secular civilian court essentially determining that the Vatican's in-house canonical procedures grossly violated the nuns' fundamental rights. So they're saying, if you're going to come into our house, you're going to play by our rules. Or as Walter Sobchak said in The Big Lebowski, across this line, you do not. So kudos again to France. I'm curious if other powerful countries, especially countries like the United States, which are very much under the sway of religious influence, I'm curious if we'll follow suit as well. So good job, France.
Yeah, but Scott, is this really the kind of victory that we need to see in this kind of circumstance? I mean, this is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is responsible for all kinds of gross acts, right? Is holding them accountable for firing a nun really that big a deal? I mean, why should we be championing this when so many other egregious things are taking place and they're not being held accountable? Why is this our moment, if you will?
Well, I mean, the first step can be the hardest. And so, a few years ago, we might not have even seen this. And so the fact that we're seeing any kind of action, I think is a good thing. I think it's the beginning of things to come, or at least I'm hoping. But yeah, France is just saying, look, we got to draw the line somewhere, and we're going to enforce we're going to protect the rights of our citizens and our residents and our visitors. And the French government does not answer to the Vatican, at least not directly. Maybe the Vatican has influence as it does throughout the world, but still, this is France. You follow French laws when you're in France.
Okay, I want to pivot to Jonathan for a minute because I think I have a good point to make to him. Jonathan, you're a veteran, right? You and I both have military experience. We operate under a code of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So, would the government have a right to step in and defend somebody that you as a commander punished under your authority, right? Why is not the Catholic Church's stance on their decision to fire a nun? Why does that have to be tested by French authorities? I mean, if you as a commander took action, would you be okay with the government stepping in and saying you shouldn't have done that? I mean, to me, there's no difference. Maybe you can explain that?
I wouldn't be okay with it, especially having been in the Navy, because there's a long tradition in international maritime law that the captain is the law on his ship. The other thing is that if the U.S. government wanted to do it, they would go through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it's, if there was a crime, NCIS, I know everybody knows what that is, would be investigating it. And if there was a security issue, it would either be NIS or it would be CID. So it's just something that doesn't happen, but if it did happen, they would have to be holding the captain accountable, and that would go through the group commander. So at least in the Navy.
All right, but
as far as I remember.
But does the church have a right to be annoyed that the federal government of France, or I shouldn't say federal government, the government of France, the legal system in France stepped in to tell them that they were wrong for following in-house procedures? I mean, do they have a point to argue?
No. It's sovereign nation, and the Vatican's a sovereign nation, but it's also a religious organization. The sovereign nation does not extend to the individuals who are in France, living in France, who are priests and otherwise, or other officials. This actually did, I think the gentleman in question actually is in the Vatican, but hey, we charged Putin with war crimes, and he's not in the country. So, it's just, when you're doing that kind of legal work, and I'm not a lawyer, the only law I know is UCMJ and a few other things when I had to be on a court martial, or it wasn't a court martial, but when I had to act in that capacity, when you get to be a senior enough rank, they tap you for that sort of thing. But the idea is that these people are citizens of France. They are subject to the sovereignty of France. They can complain about it all they want. They can whine. They've whined anytime they've ever had to submit to secular law. And you can just make a case for all of the really bad child abuse that's happened by the church.
Yeah, and
in France there was a study done, and there were over 330,000.
Actually, Jonathan, if you don't mind, I want to put a pin in that because I want to come back to the study. I actually have some statistics on that study, and I actually do have a question for you on that one. But before we move on that, Richard, I have a question for you, my friend. So we're talking about different ways that we could kind of examine how this could be sliced, if you will. I mean, we could argue that the French authorities were in the right, but I still want to kind of attack different angles. I mean, let's look at this nun, for example. So did the nun get what she should have expected? I mean, let me put it to you this way. The nun joins the Catholic organization. She stays there for several decades. I mean, she knows what some of the internal processes and policies could be. Should she be surprised that she was relieved for whatever reason? And does she have a legitimate beef? I mean, she knew what she was getting into, didn't she?
Well, this opens a whole other lines of things to talk about. I mean, first of all, we don't know what she was accused of doing wrong under their doctrine. So, and I am a retired lawyer after 41 years. So I look at those things very carefully. And you know, people ask me questions all the time, and I'm always asking them 50 questions back to get the facts before I give somebody an opinion. And in this case, we have no idea what they did. You know, I mean, she could have, who knows? I mean, we just don't know. So I don't think we can make any waves that direction. What I'd like to talk about is a couple of things. One, if you look at the history, and I think Scott mentioned this somewhat, but the history was years ago, you know, the Roman Catholic Church ruled Europe. End of the discussion. You know, that's why they called it the Dark Ages. But in any case, and now what's happening, and this is a good first step. I mean, it's the transition of, you know, theological authority versus civil authority is starting to happen. I know the law in the United States, and it's unfortunately not as good as France. You have a situation here where the Supreme Court will not even entertain looking at somebody challenging some internal doctrine. It's like, no, we don't touch that stuff. And if somebody, like in this situation, got fired and somebody said, well, that's a violation of Title VII or Title 11 or some federal administrative law that people are not supposed to violate, which normal businesses would get in trouble for, the court generally won't go there if it's an internal person who's a church employee and the church did it. So I think, you know, we've got a long way to go. The way I like to look at this philosophically, it's just one of my things, but I always, when we have these church decisions versus individuals, it's always, in this case, it's one government versus another government, but one government is based on laws and facts and evidence. The other one's based on rules that were developed out of pure mythology, based on some unknown, unprovable supreme person telling them what the rules should be. And then we always have these various levels of bishop and cardinal and pope interpreting as it comes down the line. So, you know, I am really applauding the French for that, because we need to get away from theological rule. I mean,
I
that's
think there's
great.
Yeah, I think that there's some agreement across the board on that. I think Scott made that point. I think I see Jonathan shaking his head. I want to kind of go back, though, to this point that you made, Richard, when you say, you know, this is kind of an individual versus, you know, with from a country of laws and a system of laws versus kind of this mythological thinking. And Scott, you know, on that note, what concerns might the public have if religions are held to the same standards as government entities? Could this equality somehow strengthen the influence that religious organizations have over government? Or is it not a fair comparison?
I'll answer that in a sec. I just want to make a quick comment about what the three of you were talking about. As the only non-military on the panel tonight, I'm curious. You were comparing it to like a military presence in another country, but in those cases, like if the U.S. military has a base in France or something, isn't there some kind of agreement with procedures? It's not like, you know, the U.S. just doesn't walk in there and say, okay, get out of our way. Here's what we're going to do. And this is how we're going to do it. There's usually some kind of interaction between the government, and it's ultimately up to the up to the French government in this case, whether or not they want to let the country have the base there or whatever. So I think it's not exactly the same thing. And you know, if the church isn't, I'm assuming that they don't have agreed upon diplomatic ties here, connections here. So I don't think it's the same situation. I think the military works in cooperation with a foreign country, as opposed to the church, which is just saying, you know, we'll take care of things. We answer to God, not to you, even when we're in your country. So I think there's a slight difference there. Okay. But you asked if sorry, could you repeat your question then? Yeah.
So this idea that, you know, we have a religious organization, right? It's centered on mythology. It's centered on kind of belief. But what concerns should the public have for religions being held to the same standards as government entities. Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? I mean, could this
Right.
equality could it take on a reverse effect and somehow strengthen the influence of religious organizations if we continue to see the church's kind of private rules infringed upon, if you will, by legal systems of various governments?
Well, I think saying infringed upon, I think that's granting them a little too much. It's not, and it's interesting that you phrase it that way, because that, and I'm not saying that you're speaking on this from a privileged perspective, but I think that kind of phrasing of it indicates some kind of privilege that the church has enjoyed for a very long time. So they see this as something of curtailing of their rights, when really they're just being held up to the same expectation as everybody else would be.
Yep.
And that's interesting, because the way the Pope was complaining about it, he said that this is a violation of his religious freedom, but they're in a unique situation because they also have as they're not only a church, but they're also an independent nation. And so they have diplomatic connections as well. So, I mean, are they going to be a religious organization, or are they going to be a governmental organization? It seems like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. I looked at justice.gov to see if I could find any information on this, and from what I read, this was from a little bit on the justice.gov site regarding the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and basically what it says is foreign governments are allowed to influence the host government, I suppose we could say, in the U.S., as long as they're being transparent. And so and again, that's an agreed upon relationship there. It's the United States would give permission for a foreign government to come in under certain conditions. You have to be transparent, and they have the right to reject them from the country and that kind of thing. So I think there is, I don't know. I suppose anything could happen, right? Will pushing back against the religious organization actually, are you asking if it'll sway public opinion, or will it affect the actual relationship between the church and the country? It's tough to say. It's tough to say, public opinion can, goes the direction that the wind is blowing that day. But I think that, I think this is a step in the right direction. I think, I think if there are repercussions and it pushes back, the pendulum swings the other way, I think it's because the relationship has been left unstructured for too long.
And on that note, I want to talk about that unstructured relationship, the lack of accountability. I think that we're kind of all alluding to a little bit. And Jonathan, you had a point you wanted to make about a study back in 2021, I believe it was. So go ahead and tell us about that.
Well, there was a study done in France by an independent organization of child abuse by the Catholic Church in France, and they collected data from all over France, and it really struck me that that there were 330,000 victims, and of that, only 20 cases were sent to prosecutors. 40 were refuted to being passed to the church for action because of the statute of limitations or some other legal issue. 60 out of that many, it's just ridiculous. And it reminds me of where in, I think it was Illinois, there were 451 Catholic priests, as well as religious brothers, monks, who abused at least 1,997 children across Illinois.
Yeah.
And I have no idea how many of those, I think we did something on that before. I don't know how many of those have actually gone to court. At least in the United States, if it's brought up to civil authorities, it becomes a civil case unless the church can make a case for for it not to be, but I don't know what that would be.
So that
But
study,
these things, and I get really angry at this, and there's a reason I get angry at this. I'm a victim too. So this torques me more than anything else, with the possible exception of one thing that's not the topic.
well, that study that you're referencing, go ahead, Richard. I'm going to kick it to you in a second, but I just want to clarify. So that study you're referencing was in 2021. It was done by an independent commission on sexual abuse by the Catholic Church in France. It found that between 1950 and 2020, 330,000 children, 80% of whom were boys, were abused by clergy members. And so that is a very popular study. There are plenty of studies out there that find similar numbers. Richard, you had a comment that you wanted to provide just now, so go ahead.
Well, a couple of things, and I probably should have said this earlier. I think there's a way in which we got a little far afield here, because the fundamental relationship here is an employer-employee relationship. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened. An employer fired an employee. And
good point.
In all the states where we live, there are rules about that, and there are federal rules about that for non-discrimination, for people. If you're in a union, you got a grievance procedure. If you're not, you might have somebody to appeal to. But the point is, that's what was really going on here. And so, not knowing what she was accused of, the French government took a look at it, and they said and it wasn't clear in this article, but obviously under their employment regulations, this was improperly done. I mean, that's fundamentally what they're talking about. Now, with regard to the child abuse stuff, I know colleagues of mine who have sued the Catholic Church for multiple 6 and 7, 8-figure settlements for the stuff that they've done to kids, and several of the local churches filed bankruptcy, and a variety of other things happened. But that's a whole other thing in terms of government, so I don't think some of the things that we got off into kept us focused on what was really happening here. Is this woman had been working for this organization for so many years, and they fired her.
Richard, I think that there is a larger story here, and I think that Scott alluded to that very well when he said, this could be the beginning where we see the church being held accountable because governments are stepping in and treating them according to the rules that the rest of society is being held to. And you know what? Richard, you made the point that
I wasn't disagreeing with that. I was just pointing out what was really the issue here. So we stay focused on what happened. The bigger picture, obviously, is it's a move in the right direction of not having theology overrule government.
Right. And I agree with you there. And I think that what we can take away from this whole story is that investigating the conflict or the interests of mythological religious organizations versus the state goes to show us that there might be some room for the state to actually succeed in holding these organizations accountable. And so I think they are related in that note. I want to give everybody 1 minute each to wrap up. I'm going to go to Scott, then I'm going to go to Jonathan, and close out with Richard.
I would just say that curtailing privilege is not the same as oppression, and enforcing the rights of employees is not necessarily, stepping on the rights of employers. And so I think that I do think this is a step in the right direction, and I hope to see more of it.
Excellent. Jonathan?
Religious freedom is not an excuse for violating the law. We're working towards equality under the law. We may have the law here in the United States, but I think this is a good step in that direction, where all organizations are subject to the same legal framework.
Yeah.
Or if not the framework, at least, whatever the laws of their particular jurisdiction are.
Richard, final thoughts.
Well, I just want to remind people of a program we did not too long ago where a couple of different things were talked about. One of them was some law, I think it was either out of Mississippi or Louisiana or something, but some local politician came right out and said that, God's law supersedes government law. And then we also had that IVF decision out of Alabama. I read the whole thing. I had to stop myself from gag reflex a couple of times, because the concurring opinion by the Chief Justice had 3 or 4 quotes from the Bible and a quote from John Calvin. I mean, that's pretty hardcore, and was pushing that this is how we make decisions. And there we're back to that mythology guiding us as opposed to rational, evidence-based, logical thinking and what's good for everybody that we all agree upon, as opposed to what some narrow leadership group that comes from on high tells us what we have to do. You know, that whole thing of the divine right of kings and all those wonderful things that we've worked out of. And we just got a lot more work to do to move
Absolutely.
toward secular governance.
Absolutely. And, you know, this story is a great example of a friction between the state government and the religious organizations. And, you know, therein lies the mission of the atheist community of Austin and us at the nonprofit. So if you want to see more content like this, folks, just click the link below.